Let's kick it off and say, okay. Um, Again, I just want to greet everybody a very pleasant afternoon and thank you for joining our webinar. I would like to specifically welcome and thank Dr. Jerome Kim for his time in sharing with us many aspects of vaccine and vaccine development. We are indeed fortunate to have Dr. Kim as an expert in the evaluation and development of vaccines. Dr. Kim is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, whose mission is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. Dr. Kim's technical expertise as a doctor from Yale University School of Medicine, combined with his practical experience, including as a principal deputy and chief of the Laboratory of Molecular Virology and Pathogenesis in the U.S. Military Research Program, and as the project manager for the HIV vaccines and Advanced Development Evaluation Project. Dr. Kim led the Army's Phase 3 HIV vaccine trials, the first demonstration that HIV vaccine can protect against infection. And Dr. Kim has authored more than 300 publications and received the John Maher Award for Research Excellence from the Uniformed Services University of the Health and Sciences, as well as the recipient of the Department of the Army R&D Award for Technical Excellence in 2013. May I request everybody to put their phones on mute until maybe question session. Without further ado, it's a pleasure. And again, thank you, Dr. Kim, for being our expert guest for today. I hand it over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Feist, and thanks to the AmCham Foundation for the opportunity to speak today about the confusion around COVID-19 vaccines. Let's see. And I think you should be able to see this. Oh. There we go.
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Thank you. The title is Navigating Through the Confusion of Vaccine Information. IVI is chartered by the UN, the United Nations Development Program, to accelerate vaccine research and development for global health. Our mission is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. Oops. IVI has 36 state parties and WHO as members. Spain, Madagascar, Argentina, and now Colombia are pending admission. What we're doing is essentially they've requested admission, they've been admitted by our board, and we're waiting for them to deposit instruments of accession to the Secretary General at the UN. We have field programs now in over 28 countries, 23 nationalities, in a workforce of about 184 people located in Seoul in South Korea. This is our new strategy. IVI is actually a tripartite organization. There are 3 parts, and it's difficult to separate the parts out. We in one part are a research institute. We develop vaccines in the laboratories at IVI. We do animal testing in the laboratories at IVI. But at the same time, we can transition those products or other people's products through a process we call product development, which takes a vaccine through human clinical testing in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, allows the vaccine to be approved by a national regulatory authority. So in Korea, it's the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. In the US, it's the FDA. And then helps globally to deliver that vaccine to help develop the kind of data or information that countries need in order to make sound recommendations about the use of particular vaccines. At the same time, we're an international organization with member states and state funders. And we work with a host of different organizations, philanthropic, private companies, and sometimes individual countries, in order to move our our mission of developing vaccines for global health forward. This is a list of the countries that includes some of the countries that are still pending admission, such as Argentina. This is how IVI achieves impact through innovation, empowerment of our local collaborators. So, you don't see a big IVI institute in Africa. What we would rather do is work with countries and partners within countries, transfer the ability to do the kind of research that develops and tests vaccines, and then help them to apply on their own for additional funding. So a large part of what we do is capacity building and technology transfer. And finally, IVI can only do these things through a network of collaborators, funders, and partner organizations that really together believe that vaccines can make a significant impact on the health of people around the world. Now moving on into COVID-19. So I think that it's easy, or it is at least easy for me, to think about the truths of COVID. As of the 3rd of September, there were over 200 million people who'd become infected, and we think that this is an underestimate, and over 4.5 million deaths. And again, there's a profound belief that this is an underestimate. We know that the vaccines, and at this point, 24 different vaccines have been approved by different regulatory authorities around the world, are safe and efficacious. 5.5 billion doses of vaccines have been administered. 200 to 300 million doses of vaccines are being made every week. All of the World Health Organization emergency use listed vaccines are effective. So not only do they work in phase 3 clinical trials, where we are doing basically an experiment to see if the vaccine is safe and protects against disease, but also now in the real world, after dispensing 5.5 billion doses, we're beginning to generate the kind of evidence that you want to see when you use a vaccine in a large population. That is, the vaccines under real world conditions, that is not in a clinical trial, not being monitored by PPD or Quintiles or any of these or other organizations, but under real world conditions, vaccine being administered in the field, the vaccines that are WHO approved have effectiveness in preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death of over 80%, and in many cases, over 90%. We know that COVID-19 vaccines that we have today at least protect against the variants of concern or viral mutants that we know of. We also know that vaccines work best when used with other measures, at least for now, which at this point still includes masking and use of distance. We know that COVID mutants or variants could potentially undermine the effectiveness of vaccines. And when we think about the $20 billion investment that the world made in developing safe and efficacious vaccines, the idea that we would let uncontrolled outbreaks go unchecked, generating large numbers of mutants that could very well undermine our successful vaccines is crazy. So we need to stop outbreaks, and stopping outbreaks will stop mutants, and stopping mutants will stop the disease and death. And the way we do that is by vaccinating people as quickly as possible and continuing to use masks and distancing until such time as we have the pandemic under much better control. So when you're developing a vaccine, there are really three steps, and it sounds pretty simple. Prove that a vaccine works, make the vaccine in significant quantity, and then use the vaccine. We have 11 safe and efficacious COVID-19 vaccines that are in widespread use. 7 of those vaccines have actually achieved World Health Organization emergency use listing, which means that the World Health Organization has vetted the manufacturers of those vaccines and stands by the quality of the clinical data and the manufacturing of those vaccines. At least 24 vaccines have been approved by one national regulatory authority somewhere in the world. So I think we've pretty much shown that we can prove that vaccines work. I think the big questions that we have now, the questions that will make or break our response to this pandemic are, can we make enough high quality vaccine quickly enough? And can we use that vaccine effectively now? Can we actually vaccinate 8 billion people on the planet Earth? It's really important to remember that as difficult as it was to prove that vaccines are safe and efficacious in 10 to 11 months, it is an even more daunting task to make 16 billion doses of vaccine and then to use it effectively to prevent COVID-19 spread throughout the world. Normally, vaccine development is a process that takes 5 to 10 years. And what I show at the top here is the typical pathway. Preclinical means the testing of the vaccine in animals to see if it generates the right kinds of protective responses in animals. Then we take it into the first human phase, phase 1. Phase 1 is really designed to look at safety and typically has about 50 to 100 people. If the vaccine is safe, and at that point we may have some inkling that it does generate the correct protective responses, a vaccine is moved into phase 2. Phase 2 has between 100 and 600 or 700 individuals and really is designed, again, to look at safety, but also to look to see whether we can measure protective antibodies, that is, proteins induced by vaccination that bind to and inactivate viruses, and whether it generates killer T cells, the kinds of cells in the body, immune cells generated by vaccination that will help to control viral infection by eliminating other cells that happen to be infected by the virus. And if we're satisfied with those data, then we move into phase 3. Phase 3 is the longest and most expensive phase. It often involves tens of thousands of individuals. In the HIV vaccine trial that we did in Thailand, it was 16,402 Thai men and women aged 18 to 30. In some of the COVID-19 vaccine trials, it's 30 to 40,000 people. Some of them getting vaccine, some of them getting an inactive substance that we call placebo. At the end of a phase 3 trial, or actually somewhere in the middle of it when we do what we call an interim analysis, which is something that the vaccine companies have to negotiate with the National Regulatory Authority. It's essentially an authorized peek at the data. Sometimes the interim analysis will suggest that the vaccine is working extraordinarily well, as it has for almost all the COVID-19 vaccines. And the National Regulatory Authority allows the vaccine to be approved or emergency use listed. But with COVID, we didn't have 5 to 10 years. We know that this process is also fairly risky. The vaccine companies tell us that for every 10 products that start out in the laboratory, only one of those products makes it all the way to the finish line. That is, being able to be used in clinics around the world. The cost of vaccine development is $1 billion. So if you have a 90% failure rate and a $1 billion price tag, you can bet that companies are very careful about what moves forward for vaccine testing. But with COVID, we didn't have the luxury of time, and governments around the world accepted that there would be risk, but proceeded to evaluate multiple COVID-19 vaccines at the same time. And lo and behold, by moving the phases together, by telescoping them, we were able to show that the vaccines developed were safe and efficacious. In fact, when you look at the efficacy, the ability of the vaccine to protect against disease, the analyses that were done were exactly what we would do if we had 5 to 10 years. We had less time to look at safety. And I know that has occasionally worried people. But what we do know from previous experience, and that's lots of previous experience with other vaccines, is that the bulk of side effects occur within the first 2 weeks. And certainly 99% of the bad side effects are going to occur within the first 2 months. So what the regulatory authorities did was they said, so we understand when these side effects occur. So we will only consider your results valid, your safety and efficacy results valid, if you have at least 2 months of follow-up for safety. And that's exactly what happened. The companies waited until they had at least 2 months of safety, and then they unblinded. They took a look at the trial results. And as I think everyone remembers, back in November of 2020, we started to see results that were just remarkable. Efficacy of 95% or 94.5% or 92%. Those early vaccines very quickly established that COVID-19 vaccines developed in the course of 10 to 11 months could be efficacious. And the data that came out of the clinical trials also suggested that these were safe. This is just a list of those vaccines, and I put them here not because it's at this point comprehensive, but it does give you an idea of what went on. These are some of the earliest vaccines, and they contain some very interesting tidbits here. Moderna and Pfizer are RNA vaccines. We've never had an RNA vaccine approved before. Now we have two. We've never had a DNA vaccine, yet Zydus Cadilla's DNA vaccine was recently approved by the Indian Regulatory Authority with an efficacy of 66%. Now, everyone will think, well, that efficacy of 66%, that doesn't sound very high. But that's an efficacy of 66% against the Delta variant. So when Zydus Cadilla did its trial, the Delta variant was still very, very prominent in India. And so this is actually efficacy against Delta. We think that effectiveness will be higher, and I'll get to that in a second. What's shown in gray are those vaccines whose level of protective antibody, what we call neutralizing antibody, was under 100. What's shown in yellow are those vaccines whose protective antibody titers were between 100 and 500. And in green, those vaccines whose protective antibody, neutralizing antibody, was greater than 1,000. But you can see that efficacy was shown throughout this spectrum. So you could have tons of neutralizing antibody as Novavax did, or you could have relatively low levels, 16 or 34, as CanSino did, and still show protective efficacy, protection against disease caused by COVID-19. So proving safety and efficacy was one thing. Making it has proven more difficult. And why is that? Well, you know, when we think about a vaccine that's in very common use, one that is probably the vaccine that is used in greatest quantity globally every year, that's influenza virus vaccine. Influenza vaccines made by a couple of 24 companies around the world. We make 400 to 500 million doses of influenza vaccine every year. We have already given 5.5 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine. So we've made and distributed 10-fold more vaccine for COVID-19 than we do for influenza. And that's not enough. And we know that it's not enough. Well, how much vaccine could we make? So to answer this question, UNICEF went around to all the vaccine manufacturers that had COVID-19 vaccines and said, so assuming, you know, given where you are in your development cycle now, how many doses of vaccine do you think you could make in 2021, 2022, and 2023? And it's really kind of instructive. The companies said that they could make 12.6 billion doses of vaccine in 2021. Now, we've already dispensed and used about 5.5 billion. It's already September. So I think we're probably going to fall short of this total. When UNICEF asked the companies, well, how much can you make in 2022? They said 30 billion. And in 2023, another 30 billion. You know, that would be an extraordinary amount of vaccine. And we're not sure exactly how much we'll have. Maybe there'll be lags in production, as there often are. And maybe we won't be as high as the 12 billion that we expected to have this year. So the other thing that UNICEF did is it actually went to the companies that it knew had made WHO-approved products before. And those companies account for about 5 billion doses by the end of 2021, and 11 billion doses in 2022, and a little more than 11 billion doses in 2023. Now, how much vaccine do we need? So if you think there are 8 billion people in this world, we need about 16 billion doses if everyone is going to be vaccinated with 2 doses of vaccine. I think everyone's heard that some countries, the United States, Israel, and now Europe, are thinking about doing boosters. So every time we think about a booster, we have to think another 8 billion doses. Companies are going to be making huge quantities of COVID-19 vaccines for an extended period of time, given the delays that we've had rolling vaccine out to countries around the world. How are they doing this? You know, if every year we only make 400 to 500 million doses of influenza vaccine, how are you going to make 5.5 billion, or much less 11 billion or 30 billion doses? Well, companies have been partnering together. What you see in green here up in the left-hand corner are the manufacturing locations for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, for the Sinovac, or as Sinovac, the Chinese company calls their vaccine, CoronaVac vaccine, or manufacturing locations for Novavax. Companies have distributed manufacturing all over the world. Contracting and licensing agreements have been made between all of the major companies and other major companies. Actually, in a manner that is totally remarkable. I have never seen Merck, which is a major vaccine manufacturer, make a vaccine for Johnson & Johnson, which is actually a relatively small vaccine manufacturer, or to have a vaccine manufacturing giant, Sanofi, making Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine. And actually, so that's a vaccine from a small German biotech. Under normal circumstances, Sanofi wouldn't do that. These are not normal circumstances. And the companies are responding by putting out hundreds of millions of doses a week. Right now, between 200 and 300 million doses of vaccine are being made every week. Finally, using it. Remember that vaccines don't prevent disease. Vaccination, the use of that vaccine, prevents disease. But access is very important. And why am I bringing up access now? And I think in the Philippines, actually in Korea and many countries around the world, access to vaccines is a real problem. But I should point out that this is not a problem that's unique to COVID-19. So there is a vaccine against a pediatric disease known as rotavirus diarrhea. Rotavirus diarrhea is actually pretty significant. In the days before we had a vaccine, it would kill between 200 to 300 or 400,000 children a year. The US FDA approved the vaccine in 2006. By 2014, 70% of US children received the rotavirus vaccine. Rotavirus diarrhea has disappeared in the United States. At the same time, in 2009, WHO approved the rotavirus vaccines and recommended their use. Over 100 countries around the world have rotavirus vaccine in their official government programs, but globally, 60% of the world's children in 2021 do not receive rotavirus vaccine. So here's a vaccine, highly efficacious, very safe. We're not anywhere close to vaccinating even half the children in this world. And that's a problem. So this is now 15 years after the vaccine was introduced. What would happen if we let COVID go that long? What we know it would happen is that additional variants would be created and we'd be chasing our tails, making new vaccines against variants. So we had to do something. And the World Health Organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, got together and made something that was really remarkable. It's called COVAX. 190 countries signed up for COVAX. 92 countries will get that vaccine at no cost, thanks to the COVAX negotiations. COVAX hoped to provide 2 billion doses of WHO approved vaccines by the end of 2021. So far, they've secured promises for about 5 billion doses. That would reflect roughly 20 to 30% of the needed vaccine in a country, enough to vaccinate the elderly and healthcare workers. COVAX was seen to be a bridge to what we call near concurrent access, which is just a simple way of saying, never before have we been able to get this much vaccine out to middle-income countries and some low-income countries as quickly as we have. But COVAX's target was 2 billion doses. And as of September 3rd of this year, only 236 million doses had been distributed. We're far short of where we should be. But should we be worried about that? Well, yes, because a failure of equity and access will precipitate 3 crises or have 3 major consequences. The first, of course, is the humanitarian crisis. Back in the middle of 2020, the Gates Foundation paid for a modeling study, which basically said, if we take the first 2 billion doses and only vaccinate people in high-income countries, global COVID deaths will double. Well, back then, global COVID deaths were in the 1 million range. A year later, they're in the 4 million range. We are living out the predictions made in the model from 2020 because we haven't been sharing. 60% of the people in this world have not received a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine. 85% of the vaccine that's been used or dispensed around the world of those 5.5 billion doses have been used in high-income and upper middle-income countries. So the humanitarian crisis. The second crisis is economic. And we talked about this actually before this started. But modeling from the National Board of Economic Review and the Brookings Institute in the United States, and of all places, the Office of National Intelligence, which is the the CIA office that operates in the White House in the United States, all came to the same conclusion. And that is that if we aren't able to share vaccine more effectively between high income and low and middle income countries, then we are going to have economic problems. And those economic problems are not going to be borne exclusively by low income countries. 50% of the economic burden of COVID-19, if we don't share the vaccine, is going to be borne by high income countries. And the prediction was, by all of these different modeling groups, $4 to $5 trillion in costs to the high income economies. So there is an economic crisis as well. And then finally, there's the scariest one to me as a vaccine developer, and that's the biological crisis. And what do I mean by biological crisis? Well, we know that these variants, the mutant viruses, are emerging from uncontrolled outbreaks. There are outbreaks around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where we don't really know the extent of the outbreak. And because they don't have sequencing available, we don't know what mutants are arising. And the presence of uncontrolled outbreaks generating mutants that we don't know about is a vaccine developer's nightmare. Why? Because one of those mutants is going to be the mutant that escapes from the vaccine. And that's exactly what we don't want. And I know some people don't believe in vaccines, but the other part of this is if it escapes from the vaccine, it may also escape from the immune responses, the protective responses that were generated in natural infection, so that we may be seeing second or third or fourth COVID infections if the mutants mutate enough to escape from protective immune responses. This is where COVAX is. And what's shown in orange is where COVAX hoped to be in terms of distributing vaccine around the world. You can see by the end of the year, they'd expected to have over 2 billion doses distributed. What you see in purple are the amounts that were actually shipped versus the amount that they actually anticipated shipping by June. You can see that the projections were also not so good, and that now in September, we are at 200 million doses. We're nowhere near where we are here instead of there. So even with the revised estimates, we are far short of where we need to be in order to protect the world against COVID, and for COVAX to live up to its early promise. How much money is needed? The IMF estimates $50 to $70 billion. The return on that investment of $50 to $70 billion by 2025 will be $9 trillion. A tremendous return on investment if we're able to vaccinate enough of the people in this world quickly enough. So this is the scorecard, and I've gone through this already. About 5.5 billion doses by the 3rd of September had been distributed, but only 2% of people in low-income countries had been vaccinated, had received the first dose of vaccine. 40% of the people globally have received at least one dose of vaccine, which is a remarkable thing. But there's still a long way to go. I've made this statement before, vaccines don't save lives, vaccination does. And why is this important? Well, we're actually pretty good at vaccinating children. Of the birth cohort of 130 million, 80 to 85% of children receive the standard immunizations that are recommended by WHO. That's great. A lot of countries have to struggle, have to work very hard in order to get those children vaccinated. Now, all of a sudden, these countries are going to be presented with a new problem. Now we have to go from 130 million kids being vaccinated around the world to vaccinating everybody, 8 billion people, 62 times more. And how are we going to do that? How do we prioritize who's going to get vaccinated? How do we handle the logistics of delivery of those vaccines? How do we actually train enough people to do the injections? And then there are the unknowns. Are we going to have to use booster doses? Will we have to use vaccines against viral mutants or variants of concern? How do we deal with vaccine hesitancy? And are we really able to report safety on all these vaccines being used in different countries? Some countries at this point have 6 different vaccines in use. If they're not tracking safety for each of those vaccines independently, then we could run into a problem with a side effect that goes unreported because we don't know what vaccine a person received. This gets to the problem of vaccination and delivery. COVAX vaccine, in some cases, is being destroyed because it can't be used, or has to be transferred from one country to another because a country can't possibly dispense the doses before they expire. We need to strengthen healthcare delivery services around the world in order to ensure that those 8 billion or 16 billion doses are not wasted. So the other big questions, and there are some very big ones. Do we actually know the optimal dose, schedule, and boosting of the current vaccines? And the answer is no. Do we understand what laboratory tests correspond to protection? The answer right now is no, although we're making a lot of progress on that. And that could be important because it will really speed up development of new vaccines. Are we anywhere near herd immunity? I think everyone's heard about the herd immunity. It's that level of vaccination or infection that is associated with the failure of virus to spread in a population. So vaccinated people or people who had previously been infected are protecting other people in the population. Have we been able to do appropriate surveillance for new mutants? And there are large parts of the world where surveillance is minimal. And so we don't really know what mutants are being generated there. Do we have the systems in place to do safety follow-up of all people who receive vaccines against COVID-19? And finally, how do we deal with vaccine hesitancy? And I'm going to go through this slide kind of quickly, but it gets to the idea that at least for one of the vaccines, in this case, the AstraZeneca vaccine, due to an accident, some people received only a half dose as their first dose rather than a full dose. And at some point, at least a month later, they received a second full dose. So half dose, full dose. Oddly enough, the people who got half dose, full dose had protective efficacy of 90%. People, on the other hand, who got 2 full doses, that is one full dose followed at least a month later by another full dose, had an efficacy of 60%. Is this unheard of? No. This does happen with other vaccines too. We had to make some choices when we were choosing the schedule for the different vaccines. We picked the ones we thought would work, and in fact, it did work. But other doses appear to work better. The other thing that we didn't have entirely worked out is, again, companies had to choose. What's your best guess for the spacing between the 2 doses? And most companies chose 1 month. So you get a single dose and then it's followed at least a month later by another dose. And other countries have spaced it out a bit, but basically the vaccines were tested with at a 4-week interval, 2 doses, 4 weeks apart. Well, it turns out, and again, this is AstraZeneca data, but it holds true for other vaccines as well. As you moved out, if you gave the first dose and then followed it at 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, up to 120 days later, you had the highest protection at 120, when the second dose was given at 120 days. Is this expected? Actually, it kind of is. But we were under a lot of pressure, and companies wanted to ensure that there was enough protective antibody, which really appears after the second dose. So again, we made some choices. There could be some better choices, but we need to explore those. And we don't want to move forward unless we have scientific proof that what we're doing makes a difference and doesn't hurt people. I'm going to go through correlates of protection kind of rapidly. What we can do when we do a vaccine trial is analyze what laboratory test corresponds to infection. So rather than have to do a trial in 30,000 people, I can do a trial in 1,000 people and tell you that vaccine A is better than vaccine B, or that spacing the vaccines out by 6 weeks rather than 4 weeks, or 12 weeks rather than 4 weeks, is associated with a higher level of this protective laboratory test, and that will correspond to protection. So I can do trials and optimize vaccines much faster and much cheaper if I know the correlate of protection. And papers on the correlate of protection are just coming out now, and WHO has just had a major meeting to try and help companies determine what exactly is the best biomarker laboratory test that corresponds to protection, what we call the correlate of protection. Variants of concern. And I'm showing this not to scare people. This is the original Alpha variant that swept through the United Kingdom. This is the variant that we're worried about now, the Delta variant. Delta is more transmissible. That means that it jumps from person to person more readily. It's more similar to chickenpox than the original Alpha variant, which was also more virulent or more transmissible than the original Wuhan variant. Delta appears to be more virulent. That is, it causes more severe disease and slightly different symptoms from the other variants. It appears to be more resistant to the neutralizing antibody, to inactivation by vaccine-induced protective responses. The only bit of good news here is that it does remain sensitive to the current vaccines, but in order to be protected, you have to receive both doses of vaccination. So at this point, the vaccines are still working against the variants that we're most worried about. But the variants that we don't know about are the ones that are going to be concerning to us. And remember that pandemic control is a ticking clock, or maybe a ticking time bomb. We have to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible to prevent the generation of new mutants. So if anyone wants to do something to help fight against this pandemic, go out and be vaccinated. Protect yourself, protect the people around you, the people that you love. Defeat the generation of new variants, all by getting vaccinated. This is some of the laboratory data that goes into the statement that, as far as we know, the current vaccines work against the variants, both in a test tube, which is the fastest way to generate data, but also in actual clinical trials. So for instance, the new DNA vaccine from Zydus Cadila, the Indian company that protects against Delta variant, actually was tested at a time when 90% of the infections in India were Delta. So we know that it works against Delta. We also know from other data that suggests that it should protect against the other variants as well. But we really do need better data, because better data helps us to make better decisions. And is this going to be a problem? Well, again, there's a big divide between high-income countries and low-income countries. And this looks at the amount of testing. Now, you can see low-income countries are that flat line in green. The high-income countries do a lot of testing. They can afford kits. But what this means is that in certain parts of the world where there are a lot of lower and lower middle income countries that don't do enough testing, we'll be blind. We don't know the true extent of the pandemic. So we don't know where it is. We don't know how bad it is. And it's true in much of the world where testing is not optimal. And the last thing that we want, and this again is speaking as a vaccine developer, is to be unpleasantly surprised by gaps in sequencing of new variants, because it's those variants that are going to be the ones that ultimately show resistance against the existing vaccines. This shows you where in the world sequencing can be done. So you can see in the global north, the countries in blue with the hatch marks have submitted lots and lots of sequences to the global database on COVID-19 sequences. Yellow, no sequencing capability, and I can tell you that some of these countries in here that have submitted sequences to the global database haven't submitted many. In fact, one of my colleagues in Mozambique said that most of their virus sequencing is being done in Germany of what isolates they have. So again, we're really blind, and as I think we all remember, COVID has always surprised us in the worst possible way and at the worst possible time. Herd immunity, and this, we talk about it a lot. And if you're doing vaccine work as IVI is, there are a lot of different vaccines and a lot of different herd immunity thresholds. So, and I'll use measles vaccine as an example. Measles vaccine efficacy is 94%. So not that different from the vaccine efficacy for Pfizer or Moderna. Its effectiveness in the real world is 90 to 95%. But in order to achieve that, we know that we have to vaccinate 90 to 95% of a population. So in order to achieve herd protection, we need to vaccinate over 90% of a population. We may end up being there with the Delta variant, that in order to really achieve control over this particular variant, we may need to vaccinate well over 80% of the population against COVID-19. These are just some of the other viruses that we know of. This here, SARS-CoV-2, this is the original variant. It was probably around between 2 and 3%. The current variant, the Delta variant, is closer to varicella, which is 8 to 10. 8 to 10 means that every infected individual can infect 8 to 10 others, as opposed to 2 to 3 others. So again, we're dealing with a completely different variant, and we have to be very careful. Effectiveness. So again, it's one thing to do a phase 3 trial. I've done them. what you're doing in a very scientific way is looking at protection of an individual. You're trying to remove all the biases. You're trying to be as scientific as possible. You're going to say, does this vaccine protect the volunteer? That's really important. I mean, protection of individuals is very, very important on the one hand. On the other hand, when you're a country, you're not only concerned about individuals, you're concerned about populations, about cities, about provinces. And the real question is, once we start to deploy this vaccine, does it protect people against severe infection, hospitalization, and death? Why those things? Because it's the severe infection, and hospitalization that clog up the healthcare system, that make people very sick, that transmit infection to healthcare workers. It's those people who die. If COVID-19 vaccination turns all the infections into something like a cold, then really that's a good thing. From a country perspective, you don't fill up the hospitals. You don't make it so that people who are sick with dengue or sick with other diseases or have a heart attack can't get into the hospital because the hospital is full of people on ventilators with COVID-19. The good news again is that, and these are all of the vaccines for which effectiveness data have been reported. So Sinovac, Sinopharm, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson or Janssen, all of them are highly effective in preventing severe infection, hospitalization, and death. Many of them have data against the Delta variant or against the Beta variant from South Africa. So again, really important information that again suggests that effectiveness of the vaccines is good. But those aren't the only vaccines. The vaccines I've been talking about now are in wave 1. Most of these are approved. Novavax isn't yet. Then there's a wave 1A, and I'm not sure why they call this one wave 1A rather than wave 2, but wave 1A are those vaccines that are in phase 3 now. And we should be hearing information from some of them. We've actually heard from Zydus Cadila that their vaccine protects and is now approved by the DCGI of India. And then this third wave, or actually wave 2, are vaccines that are currently undergoing late phase 2 testing and are starting phase 3 testing now. So we should be hearing about these vaccines in the first half of 2022. Some of them are very important because, for instance, the one being made by Sanofi Pasteur is a protein vaccine, so different from some of the others. Protein vaccines can be made more cheaply. We're much more comfortable giving protein vaccines to children and infants. So that may actually be an important step forward for vaccinating younger age groups. So going back again, in order to have a vaccine, you have to prove it, you have to make the vaccine, and then you have to use the vaccine effectively. We've gone through the different waves of the vaccines. We've gone through the big questions that remain on correlates of protection, effectiveness, transmission, safety. We have to make the vaccines, and I think we've all lived through a period where vaccine production was not fast enough for everybody, but at 200 to 300 million doses a week and increasing, hopefully we'll be able to catch up. Using it, and we talked about the need for equity and the consequences of not providing vaccine to everyone in this world as quickly as possible. And finally, we are going to have to continue to use masks in order to achieve what we want, which is a situation as close to the way things were at the end of 2019 as can be. So the challenges: supply, universal vaccination, that is vaccinating 8 billion people rather than 130 million in the birth cohort. Outbreaks, we don't know where they are, we don't know how big they are, we don't know what variants are being generated there. And the uncontrolled outbreaks generating variants are a source of enormous anxiety for those of us who develop vaccines. So this is the time to invest in the capacity to monitor outbreaks, to provide diagnostic equipment to countries around the world, and to be able to do sequencing, to be able to tell what the variants are. The only good news here is that the vaccines still appear to work, but we don't know for how long that will continue to be true. Finally, a lot has been said recently about the lack of global leadership and accountability. Who is really responsible for making sure that we all get vaccinated, that we're all able, that all the countries around the world can accurately diagnose COVID outbreaks or can provide information about what variants are circulating in the country? Who has the end in mind? where 16 billion doses have actually been distributed and injected into arms around the world. Who is responsible? Who's taking responsibility to do this? Because in the absence of that, we're going to have millions of independent, uncoordinated efforts. And that, if anything, will slow down our response and make it more likely that one of these variants is going to cause another huge outbreak and imperil the progress that's been made to date. IVI's role, and I'll go quickly through that. These are the capabilities. IVI is a bit like a biotech company, remember. We do a lot of different things, from discovering new vaccines to developing them, delivering them in the field, and then doing assessments of whether the vaccines are doing what they're supposed to do, reducing severe infection, hospitalization, and death. We work on a lot of different vaccines, and you can see some of them listed down here. Some of the vaccines are actually fairly advanced in development at this point. And so IVI does all of these things, but for COVID-19, we decided not to make our own vaccine. We decided to help other groups, other organizations with any COVID vaccine that they had in clinical development. And in total, it ends up being around 23 different companies and organizations that are working with IVI in order to accelerate COVID-19 vaccine developments of multiple products, of multiple vaccines in final phase 3 trials, in order to make sure that we have vaccine for everyone. So again, the truths: 200 million infections, 4.5 million deaths. Vaccines are safe and efficacious. They're also effective under real-world conditions. They continue to protect against disease caused by the mutants, at least those that we know of. We still need to use vaccines with masks and distancing. Mutants and variants could eventually undermine the effectiveness of vaccines, but luckily they don't yet. And mutant viruses are generated by outbreaks, especially large uncontrolled outbreaks. So if you want to do something, get vaccinated. Protect yourself, protect the people you love and the people you work with. Stop the outbreaks, stop the generation of mutants. And by doing that, stop disease and death by vaccinating everyone, including yourself, as quickly as possible. Thank you. Let's see.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for the presentation, and very enlightening. And you put a lot of things in perspective, the urgency, the continuing threats, and what we all have to consider and prioritize. And it's good to know that behind us, there are more and more companies, more and more people dedicated to, to producing more vaccines. But at the end of the day, they also need the help of the general population to get themselves vaccinated. The threat of the variants is certainly frightening, but hopefully, with a better understanding and a quicker response, with more and more companies getting into the production, that might help defeat the new variants before they even come up. Once again, thank you so much for providing the time, providing the expertise. We do have a few questions that people are asking, and I would encourage everybody, if you would like to directly ask through the chat, you're welcome. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I have some questions that have been sent. The first one is, maybe you could, is fairly probably easy, but is the efficacy figure on the table that you showed in your presentation is against all Delta variant or only Zydus Cadila vaccine?
That's a great question. So the Zydus Cadila one is Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. The Janssen vaccine also has data directly against the Delta variant. I think what we have more of is not efficacy data, but effectiveness data. And that effectiveness data has come out of multiple sources, both in high-income countries and some upper middle-income countries as well. And it looks like effectiveness is, at least for the Pfizer vaccine, almost 90% in preventing infection. For other vaccines, it's probably between 80 and 85%, again, with full dose vaccination. So it turns out AstraZeneca, if you've only gotten a single dose, it doesn't actually, it's not as effective against the Delta variant.
Thank you. And thank you for that question initially. And thank you, Dr. Kim, for addressing it. Another common question that a lot of people took note, sent is mixing. Some people have had, let's say, one vaccine, let's say a Sinovac, and they're concerned about the efficacy rate. Would it make sense, or would you recommend, or would you comment on uh, mixing vaccines? Let's say after the 2 doses of Sinovac, they want to take, let's say, Moderna or Pfizer. Is that recommendable, or what are your thoughts on that one?
Yes, so at this point, we have more information on using the same vaccine. So we call that homologous prime boost, but it just means that, if you got 2 doses of Moderna, getting a third dose of Moderna. And if you space it, and that's actually, again, remember, spacing is very important. The immune system likes vaccine doses to be spaced appropriately. So if you give the second dose at month 6 to month, or sorry, the third dose at month 6 to month 8, you actually get and you got originally with the first 2 doses. And that's what you want the immune system to do. The beauty in immune memory is that when it sees that that bug, the virus, or the bacterium again, the level of protective response is much higher, and it comes up much more quickly, which is really a great thing. And it's, thank goodness for the immune system. But what we don't know is whether that actually translates. So that level of protective antibody actually in a booster actually protects you against more severe disease, hospitalization, and death than not vaccinating at all. And it's difficult to interpret the data that are coming out of, say, the United States, because originally, Pfizer worked very well against the Alpha variant and the prototype Wuhan variant, right? Those are the things that were present when the vaccines were tested originally. Now we're seeing about 6 to 8 months later, the vaccine against the Delta variant. Now we know the Delta variant has properties that make it less likely to be neutralized. So are we just seeing, this is what we expect from the Delta variant, or are we seeing the effect of some decrease in immune protection? So we don't know the answer to that question. Does it hurt people to get boosted? Probably not, but again, we don't have as much information. What I can tell you about mixing and matching is kind of interesting. And it has, again, to do, and this gets, I guess, to one of the points about please don't do this at home. If we give 2 doses of AstraZeneca, we have antibody at a certain level. If we give AstraZeneca followed by Pfizer, we get antibody at a very high level, much higher level. If we give Pfizer than AstraZeneca, it goes down by 50%. So it's important to give the AstraZeneca first and then the Pfizer. If you give 2 doses of Pfizer, it's at the same level of giving AstraZeneca Pfizer. So again, it's the vaccine and it's the sequence of when you get vaccinated with which vaccine that could be very important. So with Sinovac, it looks like a third dose of Sinovac actually boosts levels up even higher than they were before. That's data that just came out. What happens if you give Sinovac and Pfizer? Don't know. My guess is that it would go even higher, but in fact, we don't know. If you give Sinovac and AstraZeneca, you get a pretty good boost from the AstraZeneca dose. Is it better than giving a third dose of Sinovac? Again, we don't have data. So we're still studying the question of mixing and matching. In general, though, at least for the RNA vaccines and now for the Janssen vaccine and for Sinovac, there are data that a third dose of the same vaccine actually does, or in the case of Janssen, a second dose, actually does boost the levels of protective antibody. That is the protein that protects you against infection. I know I didn't answer the question, but in part it's because we don't actually have all the data yet.
Yep. Yeah, that's generally the challenge in answering the question is because of the data availability or experience. But I have other questions right now. How easy or difficult is it to set up a vaccine manufacturing plant from scratch in a country like the Philippines?
So that's a great question. And we've done technology transfers to companies from Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Korea. It's not straightforward. Actually building the plant is one thing. It has to be made to a certain specification. The plans often should be approved by the National Regulatory Authority. And so it really does critically depend on whether the National Regulatory Authority has developed the capabilities that are necessary in order to review documents for approval for vaccines. So that is, can they review the manufacturing quality? Can they review the clinical quality of documents? And I don't know about the Philippines Regulatory Authority. The World Health Organization used to call these regulatory authorities functional. So for instance, the Korean regulatory is considered functional. The Chinese is considered functional. The Indian Regulatory Authority and the Indonesian is considered functional. In general, these are in countries that already have vaccine manufacturing. There are other regulatory authorities that are at the next level. They're called stringent. And the stringent regulatory authorities like the US FDA, the MHRA in the UK, the EMA, the Japanese Regulatory Authority, those are considered the highest level. Now, those organizations would take a very important interest in any vaccine manufacturing capabilities that are being developed in the country. So yes, it's possible. It's not something that you can do quickly if you've never done it before. And it does require, ensuring that all the necessary quality steps are met. What may be easier, and some countries have small contract manufacturing capabilities. Sometimes it's possible to do the last step, which we call fill and finish. That is taking the vaccine product and putting it into the vial. And fill and finish is actually an easier first step. And then gradually the country or the company can move backwards to actually making the product itself. So it's possible to do it in different ways. Countries around the world are very interested in vaccine manufacturing recently. And I think we should not warn them, but they should go into this with their eyes open. In order to have a sustainable vaccine industry, the estimate is that you need a population, or you need to serve a population of about 100 million people, which is more than the population of Korea, more than the population of the Philippines. And that's in order to be sustainable. And why is that? Because, when you have 100 million people, you have a birth cohort that's maybe 600 to 700,000 kids a year. And since a lot of the vaccines are used for kids, that would allow the company to make enough profit in order to have a sustainable operation. Smaller countries have a more difficult time unless they can band together and make regional manufacturing capabilities. So again, this is something that needs to be thought about carefully. I know the WHO is helping countries around the world, including countries in Asia and Africa and South America, to look at these regional manufacturing capabilities. And it's something that governments, I think, are very interested in right now. And it's complex, though. And it has to do as much with building the facility and having vaccines as looking at regulatory authorities, and then finally at sustainability and profitability.
As a follow-up question to that is what kind of support can IVI provide if a company in the Philippines would like to put up a vaccine manufacturing or request collaboration?
So we can assist in technology transfer. So we can use, for instance, IVI vaccines as a basis for basically teaching a company what the process is, working with the regulatory authorities in order to strengthen them if that's needed, in order to put into place all the pieces that are necessary in order to do that. And actually, we're in discussion with some countries now with funding through various sources, the regional development banks and/or state country-to-country loans that can be used to support that kind of activity. But again, IVI itself doesn't have the kind of funding that is necessary in order to build out manufacturing capability. But we do have products to license, and we can actually refer other companies to you that are willing to transfer their products to a company that has manufacturing capability.
Yeah, Philippines has a lot of manufacturing capability of pharmaceuticals. But I would imagine that or maybe would you say that the greatest challenge that would be technology transfer, and that's where IVI can possibly come in. Would that be correct?
Yes. So, and no one asked the question yet, but this question of patent waivers often comes up. And it's actually not the patent as much as it is the know-how that goes into making a vaccine. So, for instance, IVI's vaccines at this point don't have patents on them. But in order to make that vaccine, you have to get this book from us that really goes through all the plans for doing each step of the manufacturing process and all the testing that needs to go into place in order to verify that what you made at step A is what was supposed to come out at step A. And regulatory authorities will require that. So, so IVI definitely does help with technology transfer. Again, there's been an interest and there could potentially be funding through regional development banks and some other countries for vaccine-related manufacturing activities. It's just going to be important for countries and for companies to think carefully about what their business plan will be.
Fair enough. Here's another question from attendees. Is it correct to assume that the population who refuses to be vaccinated will acquire natural immunity sooner than later, given how contagious the variants are and will be? So the unvaccinated really only have two choices?
Yes. So it's correct to assume that a population that refuses to be vaccinated will probably be infected at some point. And we see this in for instance, in the United States, with almost 70% or my own state, which is the state of Hawaii, the 50th state. They have vaccination rates of 80% receiving a single dose, yet their hospitals are full. They're full of people who didn't get vaccinated, and some people who were vaccinated and have mild to moderate symptoms and have to be hospitalized. But yes, the unvaccinated are much, much more likely to end up in the hospital. The other thing is that just because you've been sick once with, say, the Alpha variant doesn't mean you can't be reinfected with the Delta or the Mu or the Lambda, one of the next variants. So if you want to undergo infection again, or you can be vaccinated. And vaccination of someone who's already been infected actually provides you with remarkable protection, even against the Delta variant. So again, vaccination is going to be critical if we're going to try to get out from under this pandemic.
Fair enough. Thank you again for that. What about, while waiting for some more questions, any latest clinicals or experience on COVID vaccines for children?
Yeah. So some countries have opted to vaccinate children down to age 12. Israel just approved vaccines, I think, down to age 6. They're the first. The UK has declined to authorize vaccine in the age group from 12 to 18. So you can see there's a lot of difference of opinion on this. We know that COVID-19, and particularly the Delta variant, has infected and has killed children under the age of 12. So if I had children under the age of 12 and the vaccines were authorized, I would definitely get them vaccinated. We also know that children, especially with the Delta variant, are suffering from a form of what we call long COVID, where they have long-term problems. Some of them are cognitive, so mental, and others have to do with persistent weakness and difficulty with the normal tasks, including concentrating. So this is not a benign disease. It kills 2% of the people that it infects globally. And if you think that 30% of a population isn't vaccinated, and if all of them get infected, then thousands of people are going to die.
Yep. Question here is, how credible are Sinovac efficacy stats issued by Chile, Indonesia, and Brazil?
So, for instance, the Indonesia data come from their healthcare workers, and those kind of data are pretty reliable. Chile actually has a mix of different data sets. And because they have a national health program, I think that, like the UK, the data are as good as a Ministry of Health can generate. The Brazilian data, again, Brazil has a manufacturing industry of its own. They're doing some fill and finish of the Sinovac vaccine. They actually rejected some vaccine recently because Sinovac had switched manufacturers and or contract manufacturers. And the contract manufacturer had not been approved by the regulatory authority in Brazil. So the authority said, sorry, you can't, this vaccine cannot come into Brazil until we've inspected it and it's shown to be right. So I think that they know what they're doing. The thing about Sinovac is that, and there is actually data now coming out of China as well. There were some outbreaks in Nanjing and surrounding areas. In people, many people had received Sinovac's vaccine already. And effectiveness is still very high. And effectiveness against death was 100%. These are relatively small numbers. But if you think about what you want a vaccine to do, which is prevent severe infection, hospitalization, and death, these vaccines are doing that. Does it help to get a third dose of Sinovac? I think that the emerging data suggest that it will be, but I don't know the appropriate timing yet. Is it at month 8, month 6? Should anyone who has an immunocompromising condition, so say you're receiving a medication for rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis, should you get an extra dose of vaccine? Probably, because we know that those people are not going to have optimal immune responses to vaccinations. So again, I think these are questions that you have to go to your physician and ask them about, depending on the condition.
Again, thank you for that, Dr. Kim. One more is, if a fully vaccinated person gets infected, do you recommend a booster?
So I think that if a fully vaccinated person becomes infected, their immune system will actually make a huge quantity of this protective antibody. At some point in the future, I don't know, a year or two, with different sets of variants, booster doses could be required, or a different variant vaccine, but we don't know yet. But usually the infection serves the purpose of a booster.
Again, thank you. And one more here is, what's the real story of the contaminated Moderna vaccines in Japan that were subsequently disposed of?
So I don't know any backstory to that. So I don't think I could give any more information than is in the news. Yeah. But vaccine. So again, this is. I think people will remember that that there was a small contract manufacturer of vaccines in the United States called Emergent. Actually, they make some of the biodefense vaccines for the U.S. military. They were making the AstraZeneca vaccine, and then they transitioned and they started to manufacture the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And they had a problem with contamination. Right. And it turns out that they had previous problems with contamination. They were picked up, they were reported, and they happened again. But luckily, the company found it when they were doing the control quality testing. So, these are complex processes. I guess a lot of people who talk about patents are thinking the vaccines are like drugs, like a chemical that you can manufacture, the chemical structure using synthetic means. And it's not the case. Vaccines are biologicals, and it's been said, and I've never confirmed this, but it was in the newspaper, so take it with a grain of salt. The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine has 50,000 steps in it. All of those steps, or many of them, most of them, probably have quality control testing that's done afterwards. So with that many steps, there are going to be things that slip through the system. And so quality testing and being able to depend on the companies that make the vaccine and the regulatory agencies that monitor the quality and safety of vaccines is really critical. And then I think COVID has shown that. Often we forget about these. I mean, when was the last time we had a pandemic that worried everybody? Because vaccines are so effective. I mean, I think one of my colleagues, a very famous one, he's one of the main authors of the textbook of vaccines, said, the average American parent, and this is 80% of American parents, give their kids up to 27 independent shots for 14 different diseases, most of which they have never seen. It's a tribute to the vaccines. You know, my parents' generation had seen those diseases. I've had chickenpox. My kids have not. These diseases have disappeared. And so, you know, sometimes we forget that these diseases disappeared because of vaccines, and because countries have, you know, pretty uniformly required vaccination in children. We forget that, and it's really remarkable what vaccines can do, and how many parents actually get their kids vaccinated and protect them against, you know, these diseases. The U.S. CDC developed a statistic from 1994 to 2013, the 20-year period. Vaccination saved the United States $1.4 trillion in diseases, saved 732,000 lives in that 20-year period. Really a remarkable statistic, even in a high-income country like the United States. The vaccines have all these effects, but they're invisible. So no one's going to say, wow, that vaccine was great, because how do they recognize a disease that doesn't happen? It's difficult. We're victims of our own success, I think many vaccine developers say.
Well, I mean, the world will definitely be a different world today if we didn't have, you know, the vaccines, but more importantly, critical vaccines like smallpox. I mean, could have caused a great devastation. Yeah. Another question here, which is quite good, is could you comment on how the trials are run? It seems that some of the trials only test the participants who are ill, potentially missing large numbers of mild or asymptomatic cases. Are the trials for different vaccines run to the same testing protocols, or are they different?
So that's a great question, and my answer is going to be a little bit technical. So I'm sorry if I slightly slip into jargon, but when we develop vaccines and when you're developing the protocol for the vaccine, you have to be very careful about picking your endpoints. And luckily for us, for COVID, the WHO, the US FDA, and other regulatory agencies got together very early on and said, these are the endpoints that we're interested in. Prevention of symptomatic disease, so having one or two of the symptoms on the list of symptoms for COVID-19, that would include like loss of smell, shortness of breath, fever, plus a positive PCR. So if that's mild to moderate disease with a positive PCR, that was the easiest one to see, because people are symptomatic, and so they're more likely to come in to the, or to alert the study nurse something is going on, and they could be told to come in and be tested. Picking up the asymptomatic cases are harder. And so actually some of the studies did that. Actually, there's one that was done by Bharat, which is an Indian company, where they sent people home with home diagnostic kits, and they would periodically swab themselves and then bring them into the clinic. And so even if they were asymptomatic, we could tell whether the vaccine was protecting. And it looks like the Bharat vaccine protected maybe 50 to 55% against asymptomatic disease. The AstraZeneca vaccine did something similar. It was about 45% in terms of protection against asymptomatic disease, but it wasn't statistically significant. Unfortunately, there weren't enough cases. The Pfizer vaccine in that original study was about 60%. In terms of protecting against infection. Now, protecting against infection altogether, that is asymptomatic disease, is really important, because in theory, if you protect against infection, you protect against transmission. And protecting against transmission takes us into a completely different thing. This is where herd protection is so important. And why do I say that? So take a vaccine like our cholera vaccine. It's maybe 60% efficacious. So it's not like the Pfizer vaccine, you know, it's not 95%, it's 60%. You vaccinate half of a city in India and you get effectiveness, prevention of cholera-like illness up to 85%. Why? Because the people who are vaccinated are protecting the people who aren't vaccinated. And the people who are vaccinated are not only protecting people who aren't vaccinated, they're also protecting other people who are vaccinated because the amount of illness that's circulating in the population goes down. So that's what we talk about when we measure not only effectiveness, but impact. We're looking at both the direct and indirect protection conferred by vaccination. And it's a much more powerful protection if you have significant impact. And it really gets to how vaccines like the Sinovac vaccine, which had efficacy around between 50 and 60%, if its effectiveness is 90% or 85%, and it actually prevents transmission, you could be seeing herd effects that will protect a lot more people, much more significantly than the vaccine efficacy would suggest. So it's a great question. And we actually have been, for the last 2 weeks, having these really intense discussions on how we would pick up differences in transmission using the vaccines that we have now, but not in these randomized double-blind clinical trials, but using other techniques to understand the total impact of vaccination on the population, because that's what we're really interested in. I mean, a country needs to protect its population, everybody, against infection.
Is it fair to say that we may have to change our expectations? In other words, when we started with the vaccines, the expectation was to prevent both morbidity and mortality. With the emerging variants constantly coming out, we may have to settle with just preventing mortality, and accepting morbidity will be part of the course.
Right, and I think it's how much morbidity or disease, right? It's so I've described it in this way. So if COVID is a tiger, right, and the tiger attacks, 15% of people go into the hospital, 5% of them are so sick they need to be on a ventilator, and 2% die from the attack. Vaccination turns the tiger into a stray cat or an alley cat. It's still not pleasant to be around, but you don't get hospitalized, you don't go on a ventilator, and you don't die. And that is the difference. And it appears to still hold true for Delta. Although with Delta, again, you have to have full vaccination in order to have the true effect, protective effect. With Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, again, their effectiveness is pretty high. It's difficult to know how the symptoms will compare between the different vaccines. But there is a small study out of Bahrain that compares all the different vaccines all at once, because in Bahrain they used Pfizer, they had AstraZeneca, they had Sinopharm as well, and there are differences in effectiveness as well. But the study is very small, and it was done over the course of a year or 9 months now, and the pandemic transitioned from largely Alpha to largely Delta, and people who were vaccinated first got the Chinese vaccines, so they are the ones at the greatest distance from their time of vaccination. So real world evidence is really important, but it is a little less neat than what we generate in a clinical trial, which is very controlled.
Wonderful. Dr. Jerome Kim, many thanks for a wonderful session and very, very informative. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you answering and clarifying questions. Before closing the session, I'd like to just take the opportunity of thanking one of our staff members, Candy, who actually organized. Candy, can you just show yourself in the camera, please? Candy Gabrielle. Yeah, there she is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candy, for organizing this. And to everyone, thank you for joining us, and thank you for participating. And we look forward to you joining us again in our future webinars. Dr. Kim, once again, thank you so much on behalf of everybody at the American Chamber and the American Chamber Foundation. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.